to try and focus my talk a little bit more on pines today, since that's what we're working on. We could talk about a few other things too if you guys have questions, but I'm going to mainly focus on work with pines. Obviously this tree, we're not going to turn it into a little sumo shogun, right? Can't do that. It's a very feminine, thin trunk, long line. We're going to probably go into more of like a Bunjin or literati style, so more of a free-flowing design. And really with Bunjin, there's a couple characteristics that we look for. One is we want to look for a slender kind of trunk that has some decent interest to it, that has a taper that's sort of the same all the way up. And then we can get a little funky from there. We can start to place branches and do things in a little bit more of an unorthodox way. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to make a few, not going to take a whole lot off. What I do take off will probably be third-year needles, or the older yellowing needles that are going to die off anyway. So pines generally keep their needles for 3 years. Okay, so you have the third year, the year before that, and then the new growth that's coming out. So when we work with them, we try to clean off under the underpaths, take any branches that are growing downward. We try to keep things that are growing side to side, and then even coming up out of the branch is okay too. And the reason we keep those is to create like some body in the branch. Just be careful with the angles that you have. So I'm going to throw some kind of structural wire on this first, and then I'll probably start cleaning up the needles, and we'll make maybe a few cuts. So this is sort of the front that I'm looking at right here. So at the end of this tree will basically be much, much lighter in feel. It'll have fewer branches, but it'll have more of a cleaned out approach. And what we'll aim to do is when we wire the branches, we'll aim to kind of make a pad where the ends, the tips are kind of moving upward. We don't want to get too crazy where the tips are like this, okay? We don't want them to be completely flat either, but we want kind of like just that slight lift at the end, which is why it's really important to wire out all the way to the end of the branch so you can control the branch tip. So I'll put a little bit of structural wire on, and then we'll move on to some other things.
Are you using copper wire there?
Yes. So this first bend right here is going to be a little bit tough since this wire is so thick. So I'm going to try and get this anchored first. Always start on the bigger portion first that you're trying to wire. And I'm using a 6 gauge here, which is pretty heavy and not easy to bend. So you want to make sure with 6 gauge that you give yourself a decent amount to work with. So you can turn it and manipulate it where it needs to go. If you cut too short of a piece, what happens is you're sitting there trying to use your fingertips to manipulate this really thick branch or thick wire. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm just not that strong. So you need to give yourself a little bit more of an advantage.
But can you use a lower gauge so that it was easier to bend?
Yeah, so the question is, could you use a lower gauge so it's easier to bend? So just remember with wiring, the most important thing is functionality, right? You want it to look good and you want to lay it on the branch properly, but you want it to function. So if I use too small of a wire, I'm going to sit this for a second. If I use too small of a wire, I'm not going to get the bend that I need. And yeah, you can double it up and sometimes achieve the same bend that way. But just much easier to bite the bullet now and put the heavier wire on. And like you see, I'm using pliers to kind of help myself with the bend.
Mike, can you talk about why to use copper wire over aluminum?
Yeah, so the question is why copper over aluminum? One is it's much stronger. So I can use a smaller size. So for example, with generally speaking, right, this isn't a steadfast rule, but generally speaking, copper wire, you want to take about 1/3 the thickness of the branch for the gauge that you're using. Whereas with aluminum, you have to go up to about 1/2 of the diameter of the branch you're wiring. So just keep that in mind. So you have to use much heavier sizes. And then what copper, does anyone know, what does copper do? You guys know all this stuff. So yeah, so it work hardens, right? And so once the branch is set in place, it becomes much easier to wire or to hold in place.
How would you prevent the wire from like digging into the trunk of the trees?
So to prevent the wire from digging in a tree, you're not really ever going to prevent that. You just have to watch it and make sure that it's not cutting in. But on a conifer, if the wire cuts in a little bit, it's totally acceptable. You just want to be careful that it doesn't dig in too deep to where it's going to damage the branch and make it weaker structurally. Because this is a pine, or even a juniper too, it's going to produce bark, it's going to grow, and all those wounds are going to get healed over time. All right, so 6 gauge on, and the reason I did this is, again, I want to make sure that my wire is heavy enough to hold and put the branch where I want it to go. If you're ever in doubt with wiring and you're just kind of like, what gauge should I use? If you're in between, like say, I don't know, say you guys are using more aluminum here or more aluminum. So if you're in between like a 3mm and a 3.5, always go higher. Do the 3.5, right? Because you can never go wrong with a bigger gauge because it's just going to do what you want. But if you have too small of a gauge, what's going to happen is you're going to sit there and bend and bend and bend and nothing's going to happen. And then that's how you end up breaking the branch because you're bending it too much. So you can see like it was a little bit of a struggle to get that heavy wire on with this trunk being so thin. But once I get it on, I can get this bend exactly the way I want. And you can see I'm not like sitting here tugging and moving it around trying to get what I want. It goes sort of right into it. So now that I'm there, that's kind of like the main structural bend. And what I'm doing at this point is just trying to get a little bit of side to side and front to back. Because what I don't want is to have like a super flat approach. I want to have a trunk that kind of moves side to side and back, so it has some more dimension. So now we're going to focus on really cleaning these out and getting back down to 2 pairs, right? So right now what happens is there's quite a bit, and maybe you can zoom in here. And let me try to make this so you can see. So if you guys can see where my scissor is, there's quite a bit of growth and it's all coming out of the exact same area. So this whorl right here, we're going to have to take down to 2 because if not, it will just take the end of that branch and just make it super, super thick. So, and we need to do that throughout the whole tree. So that's kind of the general pruning practice for black pines. As far as like cleaning needles, you can do that different times of the year in terms of like decandling. Does anyone know where the strength in pines comes from?
Their roots.
From their roots, okay? So when we talk about, I'm sure you guys have heard this with black pine or any pine, where you're always hearing people say, I have to balance the strength. I have to balance the strength. I want the same length needles throughout the whole tree. So there's a couple different methods. The one that's worked best for me is the same method that Ryan Neal teaches, and that is that when you decandle, rather than, because generally speaking on a pine, the top of the tree is stronger than the lower portions of the tree, and the interior, the middle of the tree is kind of the medium strength. So there used to be a thought that when you decandle, you leave fewer pairs of needles at the top, few more in the middle, and then more needles towards the bottom, and that's kind of balance things out. And I've tried that, and it does sometimes work, but what works much better for me, and it's much less time consuming, is to pluck the whole tree, all the needles, to the same amount of pairs, okay? And then when you decandle, in theory, because the strength is in the roots, that's going to push the same strength to the rest of the tree. So this way I'm decandling all the same day, instead of going back like some of the older methods have been to start with the really weak shoots first to give them more time to catch up to the rest, then the medium strength, and then 10 days later the strong. But that puts you in a position where you have to go back every 10 days for a month and decandle the same tree, opposed to just knocking it out all in one day. So that's kind of where I. If you're retired, you have a ton of time on your hands, then I suppose that would be fine. But for me, it's not.
So do you go back in the fall and do a second decandling?
Yeah. So fall would be more of the time for shoot selection. I'm sorry, who asked that? That's a good question, because one of the big mistakes that gets made with decandling is that we decandle in June, we get this nice flush of growth that comes out in the summertime, usually about 6 weeks later, and then we run into a big problem with we have all these new shoots that we need to select. Sometimes you'll get 2, sometimes you'll get 1, sometimes you'll get 6 or 7 all in the same place. And one of the biggest mistakes I've seen made is that folks will go back in and pluck back to 2 right then and there. Does anyone understand why that would be a problem? If you go back to 2 shoots right there in the summertime before it's all hardened off and elongated, what do you think would happen?
Weakens it.
Weakens it. So actually what happens is, if you do that, the shoots that you end up leaving behind will take on all the strength and they'll get even longer. So the reason we shoot select in the fall is to give the tree or the shoots time to fully elongate, harden off, and then we go and select 2, and then you don't have to worry about them ever getting super thick or heavy. So this is another branch that has all the growth at the end, and it's a big kind of whorl. So we're going to try and orient that upward and get back to 2 shoots. Once I get this one done, I'll have the illustrious cameraman zoom in so we can see what it'll look like. One thing to remember is that when you go to cut the shoots, right, you want to have more of a sharper angle opposed to like an obtuse angle, right? So you don't want to have shoots that kind of make like a cowboy leg, like a big U shape. You want to have something that's more like this. So when you think about what 2 shoots should I leave, try to find the 2 shoots that are one side to side, but that orient with the most narrow situation going in the crotch area, okay? This way you don't have this weird U-shaped branch at the end. So you can pluck needles with your fingers, you can pluck needles with your hands. It's not really that big of a deal. Just make sure that you're always pulling in the same direction that the needle is going. You don't want to pull it opposite or backwards, because you can really tear the tissue and damage the shoot. So,
Mike,
yes.
could you explain the term decandling?
Yes. So decandling, and let me finish this one little piece here, and I will use a piece that I've cut off. All right. So let's go right here. So I'm just pulling some of the needles away so you guys can get a clear view. So if you see my shoot, right, you guys see the swirl of long needles that's here? And then you see where the wood has kind of hardened off, and it's kind of gone from green to yellow. And then above that is this brand new shoot. It's nice and green. So decandling is basically to come in and remove that entire shoot. Okay? And then remove the other side. Okay, so that's a decandled branch after I cut those off. One thing you need to make sure of is sometime in spring, you'll get this branch only had 1 shoot on the terminal end, but sometimes it will have 1 or there'll be another one, and it'll be generally a smaller shoot make sure that you decandle both of those. You take them both off, because if you leave one, the second flush of growth won't come. The strength will just go into that smaller one, and then that will start to elongate. So just make sure if you're decandling all of the new growth at the tip end, or you will not get the summer growth.
So what is the general purpose of decandling?
So the general purpose for decandling is to get ramification and to get your branches to go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, right? So you get that as much ramification as you can, and to keep the tree small, right? And to also, really importantly, balance the strength of the tree and get the needles to desired size for the aesthetics of that tree. So, if it's a tree like this that's really feminine and small, we don't want to have these big giant needles, but we also don't want to have needles that are only, a ½ inch in length, because that wouldn't be proportionate either to the tree. So we're always balancing, trying to find, what's the best time to decandle, and generally speaking, right, the bigger trees, where you want the needles to be longer, or for the second flush, you would start the decandling on the earlier side. The smaller trees, you would decandle on the later side, so they have a shorter growing period for the second flush.
How long do you leave the wire on?
How long you leave the wire on? So that's a really simple answer for me, but it's going to sound a little confusing. So as long as possible. And I say that because sometimes wire will cut in really, really quickly, and you might have to take it off within 3 or 4 months. But other times wire might only take or it might be 2 years before it starts to cut in. So the bottom line is that the longer you leave the wire on, the better chance you have for it to hold that branch in place.
You mentioned the red and black, multi-flush pines.
Say that one. I think you were asking other multi-flush pines.
Correct.
Let's see. So Monterey pine can be a multi-flush. I've seen them decandled and have a response, but my understanding, and I don't have a ton of experience with Monterey, but my understanding is that they're on the weaker side. So if you decandle them often, you can weaken the tree, but it will put out a second flush. I think shore pine is another one that does multi-flush. Not 100% positive on that, but I believe that one is as well. And when I say the difference between single flush, multi-flush, single flush would be like your white pines, your ponderosa pines, lodgepole pines, those kind of trees where you can't decandle them, and if you do, you cut all their new growth off completely, like you are a black pine in June, you'll kill the shoot, kill the branch off. So I'm looking for, at this point at this stage in the game, I'm trying to get the shoots that are actually stronger. I don't want to leave behind the really weak shoots in this stage where we're at, and trying to get some style into the tree, and then afterwards we're going to decandle it. So we want the stronger shoots. But generally speaking, I look for the shoots that have the tightest angle. So after I wire it, shoots that like I said, have that very acute angle, opposed to an obtuse angle that's going to be a little bit less pleasing. So that's kind of what I look for. And then side to side, you don't want anything that's growing downward or going straight up. So that's kind of the criteria I'm going off when I decide what to cut and what to leave.
And then eventually, will you want more shoots than 2, or this is just 2 shoots for while you're doing the styling?
No, so just as we progress, even in the tree's refinement stage, we always want to try and get back to 2. Because what happens is if you leave 3, you get any more than 2, you get kind of a swelling that starts to occur where they all originate from, and that causes the branch tip to swell, and it just makes for a kind of a aesthetically poor branch. So it's kind of cool. You can actually see here on this big shoot that I'm going to decandle, there's already buds. Can you see those buds in place? Let me point here. You guys see these small buds? They're actually already set. So when I decandle this, the flesh that comes out is going to be probably 7 or 8 from this site. And then the other thing I'm doing right now is I'm trying to pull back every single pair to about the same number of needles. I'm not sitting here counting like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's just kind of an eyeball, like looking at and seeing just the density of the branch, and because you'd be here till Christmas trying to figure out every single exact branch, exact needle, I mean.
Are you leaving 3 in that one?
There is 3, but if you can't really tell, but the top one actually originates a tiny bit further back, so it's not coming out of the same whorl. So that's why I'm able to leave that. The other thing I'm doing is make sure when you wire you're wiring and rotating in a direction that you want the branch to bend. So if I want to twist the branch clockwise, I want to make sure my wire is going on clockwise. If I want to twist the branch counterclockwise, then obviously vice versa, right? And then my movement for styling the branches is generally in towards the main line, and then I kick it back out just to try and create, again, that sharper angle that we were talking about.
For trees that are in even earlier stages than this one, do you still recommend the same process?
In terms of like the decandling, or?
Yeah, decandling and just kind of setting the stage for success later?
Yeah, just remember that, whenever you do something, you want to make sure that the tree's health is always the most important, right? So if the tree is unhealthy, if it's got yellowing needles, if it's not, if it didn't produce very good spring growth, if it's, if all the spring growth is just these really tiny candles, then maybe you don't decandle that year. Maybe wait. You might even wait a few years. Or if there's the trees in development, there's particular areas of the tree where maybe you want length, then if you decandle it, or if you need thickness, if you decandle it, then you're slowing down that process. So just really, yeah, it depends on the stage of the tree and the development that it's in and what you're basically trying to achieve. So there's a sort of a theory about, or when people talk about wiring, that you're not allowed to ever cross wires over, and in the general sense that is correct. You want to try and wire the tree without crossing things over, but sometimes there's a need to, and there's just nothing you can do about it. So don't get yourself too hung up if you end up doing it. But the main thing I'm doing here is I'm just trying to make sure that I'm wrapping the wire in the direction I want to turn, because this branch is kind of sideways and I need to orient it back upward towards the light. So this might be a branch that, I don't know remember who asked it earlier, but talking about how long you leave the wire on. This might be one where the wire digs in a little quicker than other parts of the tree, just because of the twist that I'm putting in it. So just whoever buys it or wins it, just keep an eye on that.
So do you expect new candles to grow at the end of summer or for next spring?
So because for the decandling that I'm doing on this tree today, I would fully expect that by August we have a bunch of new shoots.
So for every spot you've cut, you would expect 2?
I would expect at least 2, but probably even more. So, there's a few of these I'm not going to cut only because they're really weak. But a lot of these I can see the the summer buds that are already like starting to pop out, which means the tree is very healthy. So that's why I'm comfortable with going through this process of cutting it all. But again, some areas where I need a little bit more length out of the branch, I probably won't decandle. And again, just remember on this type of tree that we're creating, we want to keep this tree very fine. We don't want to have a situation where we have really thick branch tips and it just would not be good for the aesthetic of the tree.
Would you talk about the aesthetic of the Bunjin?
Yeah, in terms of just like why we would choose this style for this tree, or just, yeah, so there's this theory, it's called the rubber band theory, where I've seen a lot of folks, they try to sort of force a tree into a style just because it's maybe they're trying to impose their will or whatever it is on the tree. But, you know, basically as the tree, the thicker the trunk, right? So if it has a really thick trunk, then that's where we can kind of compress down. Whereas if it's a really thin trunk, we would elongate out, right? Trying to take this and compress this into like a little tree. I mean, yeah, we could twist it all up and do it, but it probably wouldn't look very good. It wouldn't be the best design choice for the tree. So, and then Bunjin it's again more of that kind of finer, free-flowing style, something that we put in like a shallower pot. Yeah, here's I'm gonna zoom in there real quick. Can you guys see this group of branches right here? You guys see how this side is really heavy and these two over here are really weak? So, or not really weak, but weaker. So we're probably gonna go back to 2 here and try and eliminate 1 because they're starting to become a swell right here in this area. Can you guys see how that's starting to swell up with all those branches right there? So we wanna make sure that we fix that and clean those up. But generally speaking, I try to use the central stem and then 1 side branch, because if you use 2 of the side branches, sometimes you get that really, really bad angle that isn't desirable. So take those off.
You mentioned you would expect to see new shoots in August. Would you go in again and decandle it?
Once the new spring or new summer growth comes out?
Yeah, in August, yeah.
Yeah, so that wouldn't be decandling anymore. Then we'd be moving into shoot selection.
Okay.
But shoot selection wouldn't be done in August. That would be the one that's done in the fall. Once the summer growth is opened, elongated, hardened off, then we would go back and shoot select. So before I do all the cleaning of the needles, I'm just trying to think about what branches I'm going to keep, because there's no sense in cleaning branches that I'm going to cut off. So.
How much back budding are you anticipating?
Well, this wood is pretty young, even way in here, so I can already tell you there's back budding that's occurring. You guys, it's probably too small to zoom into, but there's buds up here on this portion of the trunk already. So if whoever takes it gives it good care and the tree remains healthy, I mean, you'll probably get just a ton of back buds. So that will give you branches in areas of the tree that maybe we don't have branches now. So that's something that will be really cool. Once the wood is barked up and it has like the plates of bark on it, there's no more chances for back budding. That's when you would have to just go in and graft at that point. So I'm going to probably keep most of what's left. I always say that, but then some more comes off, so we'll see. And then a good rule of thumb for the beginners is if you're going through this and you break a branch, oh well, wasn't meant to be, I guess. No. Try not to break branches, but.
Does the tree respond differently if you're ripping needles compared to cutting needles?
So I'm actually, I like to call it pulp. Did you ask? Who asked that question? Yeah, so I'm not really it might look like it, but I'm more pulling than ripping.
Oh.
So that's what you don't want to do, is you don't want to like, if you're, this is a nice big sheet that I can show you guys. So if this is the tree and say I decide to decandle this, right? So I take this off. What I want to do is if I want to pull the needles, I want to pull them in the direction that they're going. What I don't want to do is this. I don't want to pull them backwards because that will rip into the bark. So that's just something to think about when you're pulling. So I am pulling the needles, but I'm kind of just grabbing onto them and pulling them.
Can you cut the needles instead of pulling them?
You can cut it. You can cut it off too. Yeah, you can if you want to come in and just cut every individual
trim it
needle.
real close.
It just takes a lot more time.
Is it okay?
Yeah. So
What's the right fertilizer? Does that change if you decandle?
so you're asking right fertilizer and then the timing?
Yeah. And
Okay.
what changes if you decandle?
So that's a great question actually, because fertilizing for me is done very, very intentionally. It's not just, oh, let's just throw some fertilizer on the tree because, you know, it's good for it. With black pines, if you know it's a decandling year, a year that you're going to decandle, and the tree is nice and healthy, you want to really load up on fertilizer. And I kind of start in my area right around probably January for me. And I start just heavy loading on the tree fertilizer. And that is basically to give the tree a lot of stored energy for when we go in and decandle. And then after I decandle, it's hands off. It's no fertilizer for about 6 to 7 weeks. I don't load it up with anything at that point, because what happens is if you continue to fertilize after you decandle, your summer growth is going to come in and it's going to be coarse and it's going to be just as long as the spring growth. So you're sort of just negated everything that you did by keeping fertilizing. So hit it heavy if you're going to decandle, and then slow down towards or after you decandle. And then the type to use, I use all organic. So currently I use BioGold. I use Dynagrow, which is a liquid. And then I will use fish emulsion, seaweed, kelp, that kind of stuff. But everything is all organic. I try to stay away from the chemical fertilizers like Miracle Grow and stuff like that. Not to say you can't use it, just not ideal. So there's some areas here where I'm going to probably leave a little bit more foliage than I normally would, but like kind of back here, there's foliage that there's 3 different branches coming out. They're all coming out from different places, but I'm gonna, in the future you might get down to only 2 there, or even 1, but for now, just since it's sort of our initial styling and we're taking quite a bit off, we're gonna try and save a little bit more foliage if possible. Because once you take it off, right, you can't put it back, so you wanna keep as much as you can initially. But again, that being said, don't be afraid to cut. We were talking earlier about flaws in bonsai and what do you do to correct them. Well, there's really 2 things. You can either eliminate the flaw, and that elimination might set you back some years, but you're eliminating a flaw that's never going to look pretty in the tree, or you hide it, right? So, all right. Some needles I'm probably going to cut a little bit just because they're super long. I don't generally make a practice of this, but because the branch tips will die, but we can make it work. I don't think we've talked about soil yet, right? For you guys, I know in San Diego, there's sort of microclimates where like some areas are hotter than others, and so I would say that in the cooler coastal areas of San Diego, I would say your soil mix for pine can very easily be like the Boone mix, the 1-1-1 of Akadama, lava pumice. They're equal parts. For the hotter areas of San Diego, I would probably recommend a 2-1-1, which is 2 parts akadama, 1 part lava, 1 part pumice. And that's the mix that I use in my neck of the woods because it's a little bit warmer where I live. Just to avoid the tree from drying out. Now if you're at a stage of development on the tree where you just really want rapid growth, then you can go with the 1-1-1. Pretty much anywhere.
Why would it be bad to cut the needles?
Just the shearing the needles. It just turns the tips brown. It doesn't like hurt the tree per se, but just it looks nicer after the demo to have, you know, the needles sort of uniform, not having like super long needles everywhere. But and sometimes we do it to get light into the tree, to allow the shoot to get light, because if it's got, you know, say it was really strong the year before, so it has these really strong needles, but then the shoot this year is a little bit weak. If the needles are super long around it, it can kind of shade things out. So that's the kind of a reason to get light into the tree.
With regards to watering, do you try and let the pine dry out, like completely dry out between waterings, or what's your kind of moisture gauge?
Okay, that's another really good question. I'm glad you asked, because I think one of the biggest mistakes that are made in bonsai is or at least there was conversation for several years about how a lot of conifers, pines, junipers, that you should allow them to completely dry out before your next watering. And you should absolutely never, ever let any bonsai in any pot completely dry out. Okay, because completely dry soil means roots are going to start to die. Okay, they need to be moist. Now, striking that balance is important, right? So that's why the soil becomes so important and rely heavily on the soil, because if you have soil with proper drainage and that's, you know, going to keep that balance of water and oxygen throughout the tree, then you're going to be in really good shape. And usually what happens is if you have the incorrect soil where it's holding just too much water, or it's the wrong soil that's like drying out super, super fast, then, you know, it causes problems. But one thing to think about also is the density of the tree. So this tree is going to command a lot less water than, say, a tree that has a really thick trunk with a super, super dense canopy. Because why? It's got a lot more resources pulling from those water columns, right? So you have hundreds of branches that are pulling water from the roots. That's obviously going to dry out sooner than if you have 20 branches that are pulling from the roots, right? So that's something to keep in mind too. And I think I kind of touched on it earlier, but whoever does take this home, you know, now that I've eliminated quite a bit of foliage, it might require less water, or not as often.
What about like foliar misting? You try to...
You can foliar mist, yeah. I don't, just remember, so it's kind of interesting about this also, and is that a lot of people felt, or used to, when it's really, really hot, they want to go out and mist their trees every 2 or 3 times. But what happens is it's a tree is a lot like a person, where if you go out and mist it in the really hot weather, one, you run the risk of the tree burning, and two, when you water the foliage on a hot day, it stops the tree from the evapotranspiration. So it doesn't stop it, but it slows that tree's cooling system down actually. So what's really important on the hot days is to make sure that your pots stay cool, right? So the reason you're watering is so the pots, you get cool water into the pots, keep them cool, to get the roots that cool water, because that's how they will really burn. And that's why, if you guys have ever seen, you see it a lot in Europe, where the guys will wrap like foil. You guys ever seen that? They put foil on the sides of the pots, and the foil is basically in place to reflect the sun away from the pot and keep it cooler. So that's why that happens.
Is it best to mist in the morning or late evening?
Depends on the time of year, really, but misting in the summertime in the late evening could be problematic because it gets warm. So then you're keeping your tree moist in the humid, hot nights, and that's how fungus can start to grow. So I would say probably if you're going to mist your tree, I would do it more early morning opposed to late evening. This is a great tree for a demo because it allows me to sort of give you guys some good tips and some good explanations, but I'm not like completely just spending the whole time wiring away. So I like this good material for a short demo.
Proactively try to address fungus and pests with your pines?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, I do, because the reason why the gentleman's asking about proactively dealing with that is that fungus is not like an insect. So insect, yeah, you see it, you see the spider mite, you see the aphid, yeah, you can go in and you can spray it and kill the bug and you're good. Fungus, when you start to notice it, is pretty much too late. So once you notice the fungus and you see branches starting to die, those branches are, for the most part, they're going to perish. So what you're treating for at that point would be to just stop it and slow it down. So how do you avoid that? You treat proactively, like he was mentioning. And I have sort of a process that I do in the wintertime, and then usually my spraying for fungus occurs when it goes from a really cold climate down to like a super humid day. Because again, that moisture, that's what causes those issues. So generally speaking, when I'll do it. But throughout the year I do spray. Not every single month, but I do spray pretty often.
Mike, what do you spray with?
So for pines, a good one for the fungus side of the house is going to be a copper. But you can also use, like a Cleary's 3336. But again, I think copper is probably the best one for fungus related to pines. Or you can do a lime sulfur treatment if you want. I don't generally do lime sulfur too much. I don't like how it turns all the tree white or the foliage all white. So I usually just reserve my lime sulfur for the dead wood on the tree. So yeah, those are good ones for insects like spider mites. I use something called Sultan, and it's not actually sold in the retail market. It's more commercial, but I have a friend who can get it for me. It works really well because you only have to treat it once. So with a lot of spider mite treatment, you have to spray it and then you have to come back after 14 days and spray it again. Because what happens is the first treatment generally kills the spider mites that are alive and moving on the tree at the time. But then what happens is after you kill those, the eggs that are on the tree, they hatch, and 14 days later you have another infestation. So Sultan is really strong and will take care of that. But you can do other things. I mean, you can use Safari. You can use even like a malathion would probably kill it. I don't know how well it would work, but I typically, like I say, use Sultan, or I use Safari to take care of those. We talked about like mealybug and adelgids, like a woolly adelgid, those kind of things. That kind of stuff, all Safari would take care of. But there's tons of products on the market, and you don't have to necessarily use the ones I do. But the one thing I will say to remember is that as you treat your trees with different chemicals, remember that the tree sometimes can develop an immunity to it. So don't just think that, you know, oh, I have a juniper and I treat it every year with the same chemical for fungus. Well, it may, chances are it would be fine, but it could also develop immunity and you can notice that it doesn't work anymore.
Are you not concerned with moisture loss here, where you were cutting and decandling?
Moisture loss? No. No. I left a little bit of a stub on that one because it's so big. But because the reason I left a little bit of a stub on that super strong one when I decandled it was that it's all obviously a very strong candle, and that stub will actually continue to pull energy from the tree as it goes, so that summer growth won't come out super coarse too.
Mike, I noticed that your tree is on an angle and it's high. Has it been in that secondary pot for a long time?
No, I just put it in here yesterday. And the reason I did that was to get the appropriate angle that I wanted. So it'll be important actually that, I'm glad that you brought that up. You guys are asking really some super great questions. I'm glad you brought that up because what's going to happen is whoever wins this, it's going to be important that you maintain this angle, because after I decandle this, and if you put it back to the old angle that it was at, the new growth will come out. It's going to go up towards the sun, right? So it's going to come out all wonky in different directions because it won't be in the direction that we place a tree today. So whoever wins this, take it home, and best thing to do, I would say, is to take a picture of this if you take it, and this way, when you get home, you can put it in your own pot and orient it back to the right angle that it was at.
When can you repot it?
You could repot this tree next spring. Yeah, I wouldn't do it. It's, you know, I think it's for me it'd be far too late to do it. You could maybe do it successfully. I'm not saying that, you know, that would be like a deal breaker to where it would just for sure die, but it certainly might weaken the growth that comes out if you do that. Because just remember, like, repotting a tree is a lot like open heart surgery, right? For a human, you're pretty much exposing the tree's source of energy. Like I said, especially in pine, where strength comes from the roots. The other thing you don't want to do is never fully bare root. Is ever anybody bare root trees? Anybody doing that with conifers? You can bare root deciduous, but don't ever fully bare root a conifer. Bare rooting is basically taking every single bit of soil off the tree to where all that's left are just the roots, completely void of any soil at all.
Why for the angle? Was it purely for your personal aesthetic, or was there another reason you wanted that angle?
Yeah, so I try to find it. I try to find an angle that I could have the best movement, had some nice smooth lines, and you know where the tree is moving a little bit towards us and has more of an inviting appearance to it. So that's kind of why I chose what I chose. It was when you see me, when we take it out of this pot when we're done, you guys will see kind of where it was at, and that might give you a little bit better understanding of why I went this direction with it. But there's some other ways we could have gone with this tree. Like we could have actually could have maybe even taken this off over here and just done this piece up here, and that would have been fine also. I think it would not have been the best choice, because then all the foliage starts like really high up, which again on Bunjin is okay, but I think it's cool to have this little or this kind of dropping branch here. just adds a nice kind of balance to the whole tree. So, and then I also looked for, on selecting the front, I looked for, on pines, having a nice base, a good flare at the bottom is important, and also having a good nevari or roots. So the roots here, so if you guys see the angle that it's going, it's hard off to the left here, right? But I have really, really nice roots right here that give it a sense of anchor and stability, because if this clump of roots was over on this side and there was nothing over here, it would be really hard to use this angle or use this, because it would look like the tree is just going to fall over. It would look like it have no stability. So these roots are, that was another decision I made. It also is kind of the wider part of the trunk. So for all those reasons, that's kind of why I went with this front.
When is it a good time to do absolutely nothing?
Absolutely. That's my favorite time of the year. Just when I get a break. Yeah, so pines are pretty much they're pretty much hands off. You have decandling in June. You have shoot selection in the fall, and then you have repotting right at the beginning of spring. So absent those 3 times, you're pretty much, the only thing you would be doing to the pine would just be watering it and making sure that there's no fungal issues or anything like that you need to spray for, or bugs that you need to treat. So that's pretty much those times, and then after that, you're kind of hands off.
Needles before they yellow?
Yeah, so like the 3rd year needles. Yeah, so that's different than shoot selection. So the 3rd year needles are more, that's just the needles that are the oldest on the tree, and they will fall off on their own. But yeah, if you wanna go in and remove them by plucking them out or taking them off, that's okay. One thing I would say, if your tree is not super strong, make sure you don't completely take all of the needles off. Like right now I have my new shoot here and then last year's needles, and I took everything off behind that. If it's a super weak tree, I would recommend leaving some of the pairs behind that last year's needles as well, because they just create more solar pads and more ability for the tree to produce food for itself. So more needles is better there, but in this case we're okay with taking more off.
Mike, do you happen to know if fungal spores can become resistant? Or are they always going to be affected by whatever
So you're like, yeah, so they can. That's why like varying the chemicals is important, because yes, like a fungal spore for Dothostroma or for Phomopsis, yeah, it can develop a resistance. So that's where you just kind of have to keep an eye on things. And I also recommend varying chemicals. So for example, I don't spray with the same chemical for fungus year in, year out, every year, same thing all the time. I vary it, and I do that so I just never have to worry about that happening. So I just kind of stay ahead of it in that way. But it can happen, yes.
Mike, would you repot black pines annually?
No, definitely not. The repotting time is going to be, in terms of like frequency, is going to be more relative to the size of the tree. So if it's a shohin, we're probably going to end up repotting more often, because it's just in a much smaller pot, right? So if it's in a 6-inch pot, then probably every 1 to 2 years you're going to have to repot it, because it's just going to be packed with roots. Whereas, and also a younger tree is going to be repotted more often because it's growing more vigorously. So an older tree, maybe we repot, like generally speaking, like my trees that are Yamadori, like 200, 300, 400-year-old trees, once I get them into a bonsai pot, I generally don't repot any earlier than 4 to 5 years. I keep them in there for quite some time. But like I said, younger trees, shohin size, they may need to be repotted every 1 or 2 years. Also, what you're trying to do with the tree too, like if you're really trying to get fast development, you can put it in like a colander, and those trees kind of root prune themselves in the colander, so you don't have to deal with repotting as much. I am going to decandle the top here because it's pretty strong.
What would you say would be the best way to strengthen the roots for pines, junipers?
To strengthen the roots? Like you mean if they were weak?
Yeah.
Like in other words, or if they had like a disease or something? So what by strengthening the roots, what I talked about earlier with maybe I didn't mention this, but I might have talked about it earlier with the other group, is that there's basically 3 reasons why a tree will start to lose health. One is an imbalance of water. The second would be an imbalance of oxygen, and then a fungus or a disease. And I sort of put those 2 together, or insects. So I put those 2 together because they're sort of kind of, even though not the same, but those are kind of 3 reasons why. So, but you can have fungus not only on foliage, but you can have it on roots as well. So you just have to diagnose that and treat it accordingly once you find out. But you may not know right away. That's the scary part, because you're not pulling it out of the pot every month and looking at the roots, I hope. So go ahead.
I guess what I meant would be like more, how would I strengthen the root base?
Oh, strengthen the root base.
Yeah.
Oh, so if you have like a weak base where you don't have a lot of roots.
Right.
Yeah, so getting the roots to grow, you can do a couple of different things. You can pot it lower in the pot. You can graft roots. You can try to get, use good soil, because if you have poor soil, the areas that have that poor soil packed in, they won't allow water to the roots, and those roots will die. So that's where it becomes really, really important to have a good, nicely draining soil mix.
Cool, and then what's your definition of heavy fertilizer? Is that volume and frequency?
Yeah, volume and frequency, but more probably volume, I would say. So, because I use, like I say, BioGold, right? So the frequency isn't really changed. It goes on and lasts for a month and a half, and then you have to pull it off. But yeah, there's times where I would have like my entire pot surface covered with BioGold. So again, just really depends on the stage of development of the tree. So I'm leaving quite a few shoots up here at the top, only because I don't want the apex to be super skimpy right now. More for aesthetic pleasure for viewing of the tree now, but when the summer growth comes out, you guys can, whoever wins the tree or buys the tree, can come back and eliminate this down to 2, but I left a little bit more on it for right now. Just remember, everything we do in bonsai, like you want to always have the tree's health. It should always be like the most important thing that you're considering when you're performing an operation on the tree. If you know your tree isn't healthy and you know that it's probably not going to bounce back too well after you perform the operation, I would probably say that you shouldn't do it. And wait till it's healthier. You're just going to get, the other thing too is, aside from just weakening the tree further, if you perform operations on the tree that, on a healthy, strong tree, you're just more likely to get a really good response from the tree, opposed to a weaker response and causing the tree to die back or lose branches. So now there's some kind of scraggly needles here that I'm cutting, shortening them down just to make the final tree look a little bit better. That's just more for demonstration and aesthetic purposes. It's not really necessarily something you have to do.
And those needles don't turn brown on the tips from doing them?
They will. They'll die back a little bit. But the thing is that most of these I've decandled, so all the new growth is going to come in, and it'll be nice and healthy and green. It won't have the dead ends. So yeah, pretty simple tree. I mean, not probably a big surprise for you guys on the final product, but there's a lot to be said for the simple trees. They draw a lot of interest and people really like them. I think Bunjin is a great style, especially when you pair it with a really cool pot. So now I'm just putting a little bit of movement. One thing you want to do with your branches is, if your trunk has some movement to it, then you want to put some movement in the branches. If your trunk is really straight, then you can get away with obviously more straighter branches on your tree. So that's something to think about. In other words, you don't want to have a formal upright style where the trunk is completely straight, and then have a branch pad with a bunch of kind of spaghetti curves and movement all in the branch pad. You want to have more of a flatter layout. So again, I have kind of some areas here where maybe a few more branches than are necessary, but again, more keeping those for the health of the trees right now. And in years to come, you can take them back and shorten them. I always try to, when I style the tree or deal with the tree for the first time, I always try to think about, what's going to happen 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And again, leaving more branches now is going to give us more opportunity for later to cut back to and use. Whereas if I just take everything back to what I, ultimately think it should be, then the tree is super sparse.
If you weren't doing a demo and had more time, would you be doing anything with the trunk?
If I had more time, anything in the trunk, like in terms of what?
Would you doing any trunk fest or anything?
No, I probably wouldn't do too much. Again, the Bunjin style is more of a softer, free-flowing. You don't want to put these big twists in it. This trunk is probably thin enough to where I could get a little bit of movement into it, but it's getting to the point where that would be pretty difficult to get movement in that. Even if I put like a couple 4-gauge wires on it, I could start cranking and making some movement, but I don't know that would really do anything per se to improve the tree, right? So we're just about done, and you guys can kind of see which is better. Give you just a little once around.
How would you change it in 3 to 5 years?
So what's going to really be important moving forward with this tree is to really develop the pads on this long branch. And because basically we have one branch here, but we can make this look like we have multiple branches. So we can have like a pad that goes back here, another pad that comes up in the front, another pad here. But the idea is that the smaller the tree, we want to try and break it up with a lot of different paths, right, to keep the interest in the tree. Whereas a bigger tree, heavier trunk, heavier branches, you can have a little bit bigger branch paths, but I think you can understand, like, aesthetically, you wouldn't want to have this huge heavy branch pad on like this little trunk, right? So
Like to see a taller tree?
I don't really think it needs to go much taller. The one thing that would just be important is that these two pieces are never the same length. So this dropping branch, we want to make sure that they don't stay the same. So from like here down, we want to make sure that that distance is, one is either greater than the other from here up. Because then it becomes that 50-50 and it looks too like perfect, right? So we want to have a little bit of a difference. So, go ahead.
You talked about the fungus and the needles, and you also said that it could be fungus and the roots.
Yes.
Do you repot the tree and treat the roots, or how can you tell if there is fungus on the roots?
So if there's, the way you would tell, that's another great question. The way you would tell if there's fungus on the roots is you'll see like a direct correlation to the foliage. So if you try to diagnose a tree, right, and you go, okay, black pines, what fungus do they get? They get Dothostroma, which is like a needle cast, right? But if it's not that, and the tree is just slowly dying off everywhere, then it might be like a Phytophthora where it has a root rot issue. Or it might be a root aphid that's killing everything off. So yeah, you would have to in order to fully tell, you'd have to pull it out and look at it. The Phytophthora is not something that you would necessarily, the root rot, it would just, instead of the roots having like that soft white tissue underneath, it'll be black. It'll just be dead. The root aphids you can kind of see, but it's really hard on pines because pines have mycorrhiza, which is like a beneficial fungus that grows on the roots, and it's like it almost looks very similar to root aphids. So root aphids, they pile up in areas, and they kind of have that cottony look to them. Well, that's this mycorrhiza kind of has the same thing. But once you've seen the two, and side by side, you can pretty much easily tell the difference. But for the untrained eye, it's pretty easy to mistake one for the other. So yeah, you would look, because generally speaking, the foliage is a direct mirror image of the roots. So if the roots are growing and the roots are healthy, the tree is more than likely going to be healthy and grow, unless again, like an insect is eating it, right?
Is there a special treatment for the root fungus?
Yes. So for the root fungus, for Phytophthora, I use something called Subdue Max, and you can buy that from any local stores or Amazon, and you just do a root drench with it, and that will help correct that problem.
Thank you.
You bet. Go ahead.
It looks like the dropping branch comes pretty close to the ground line. What kind of pot do you foresee this in?
Pot. I would probably go something, you can get away with a few different things. So if you really want to get funky, you can play around with like a stone and do like a slab planting with it. If you want to go more traditional Japanese, you can do like a nanban, like a round kind of, but whatever you choose, just remember that because this tree is so long, right? If you put it in too small of a pot, you have to consider the fact that it's going to topple over. If it blows, the winds blow, a windy day, or if there's a cat or an animal that comes by, it can knock it over. So, not to say not to put it in that pot, but just make sure that you tie it down and you anchor it just with rope or something on your bench so you don't lose your pot and your tree. You can go. I would stay away from square. I would stay away from rectangles. You could maybe go into a shallow oval, a little bit longer oval. Would be nice. But again, pots are really subjective, and it really has to do a lot with the person and their own individual sort of style and what they're trying to achieve. Because I've seen there's a lot of different pots now. You see like the Robert Cross pots that are like stone, and then you see the Jan Kulik slabs and the different funky things that he does. And so there's really a lot of options out there for us now. It used to be years ago that there was antique Chinese pots and there were Japanese pots. And then there were like the cheap Chinese pots, and then that was pretty much it. And all the rock plantings and things that people did were real stone, so they were super, super heavy. And now, like I said, with the artists making the epoxy resin slabs, they're very, very nicely done. They look super, super natural, and they're like 1/3 the weight. And you can drill into them really easily. So like a granite slab that you might plant something on years ago that weighs 200 pounds, you have to get there with a diamond bit, and you have to sit there and drill for a long time to get holes in it for drainage. And attaching the anchor wires is tough, whereas with a lot of these stones, you can just drill holes in, and you can add whatever you want, whatever you need to do it. So yeah, I would probably go round, shallow, not a deep pot, and so you could do like a Nanban or a drum style. Drum is might be a little strong, but it would also add some stability to the tree, so it's not toppling over. So that's something you can consider too. So yeah, and then like I said, some of these branches, just watch some of the wire in areas where I had to twist the branch, because that wire naturally is going to be a little tighter than other areas. So I'll mark the front just so you guys have it. And then one thing I talked about yesterday in our workshop was when you mark the front, don't just use one wire, use two. And you can set your first wire in, and then wherever your front is, put your second wire, and as you're looking at it, when those wires line up to where it looks like one, you know you've reached your front. If I alter this, right, and now I look on, and I look at the wire straight on, I see two wires, right? So when I move it backward, and I look straight on at it, now I only see one set of, or one wire, so I know that's where my front is. And that also will give you kind of the angle too, since I put the wires in now. Because when you cut this out of here and you set it back, everything's going to be like backwards and sideways. So we're pretty much done. If you guys, is there any other questions? I'd love to. You guys have asked some really, really great questions, and very applicable to what we're doing. So I appreciate that.